The ambition to decarbonize faster the entire economy means that all sectors will need to make an extra effort.
Decarbonized renewable energy gases will play a key role in delivering on a net zero energy system by 2050.
As per the gas industry, I think that setting a EU-wide target for renewable gases will help the industry to make that effort and also will contribute to new 2030 climate targets.
Well, good morning, everybody. I hope that you can all hear me. And indeed, we're looking forward to a very good discussion on a very important topic. This is the second in the series of Eurogas's Let's Meet webinars. Of course, we are bringing our webinars to you because of the current and ongoing COVID-19 pandemic situation. But indeed, we think there's still plenty of reason to meet and talk about the major policy issues of the day. And this webinar indeed is going to be looking at one of those most important issues, and that is the 2030 targets, scheduled for discussion in September once the European Commission has finalized its impact assessments. And also at the moment, we know that we have the climate law that's been launched by the European Commission earlier this year, where indeed many of the political groups in the European Parliament are exploring the opportunity to pursue more ambition in relation to the 2030 targets. And we'll be very keen to follow the discussions that are going there. I suppose with the COVID-19 pandemic, we're also wondering what this will mean for the Green Deal, and whether or not the Green Deal will be mainstreamed in the recovery plan, or whether it will be sidelined. And I suppose those are issues that we all together wonder about. And within the discussions around the 2030 targets, the theme of this webinar is very much looking at whether or not we need targets for renewable and decarbonised gases. And if we increase the ambition, would we need to be looking at how we could also drive the uptake of renewable and decarbonised gases? Well, the good news is that you're not going to just have to listen to me waffling on all morning, although I do like to talk about these topics. I've got the pleasure to be joined by three experts on the matter from three different organisations. We will have introductory speech from Dr. Luis Manuel Schulz from the German Permanent Representation, who will surely take us through the presidency's priorities, as the Germans will be taking over the Council of the EU's presidency as of July. And I imagine it'll be a relatively tricky task, given the fact that we will have to be probably conducting most of the council meetings in this fashion as well. And I'm sure we'll hear more from him on that. He'll be followed by Andreas Graf, who's indeed responsible for the EU level of energy policy in Agora Energiewende, and he'll be telling us a little bit about the work and the studies that they've been doing and their views on how we could achieve more ambition in 2030 and what roles there could be for renewable and decarbonised gas within that. And then we'll be finishing off with Maximo Miccinilli, who's working for CER, the Centre for European Regulation, another think tank based here in Brussels that indeed has also had a study looking at the role of decarbonised and renewable gases and the contributions they could make to increased ambition in 2030. So as I say, we are blessed in many ways to have good experts on the matter here this morning, talking to us about the various elements that we can imagine that we need to address in the coming 6 months to set us on track to reach that climate neutrality target in 2050 and the interim targets at 2030. But before we go, I need to do a little bit of, I should say, housekeeping. Just because we are online, it doesn't mean that we don't want to be interactive. We do very much want to be interactive. And I would like to ask all of you, all the participants, we've got around about 280 registrants, and so far as I can see, at least 180 have shown up. So I expect that number will rise. What we would like you to do is to go into the right-hand side. You see the control bar. There's a question box. If you pop that out, you should be able to write questions to us. And as the moderator, I will receive your questions. So please do fill in questions that you would like to ask our panelists, and I will actually ask them for you. If you keep them short, that's the best thing. From my experience from the first webinar we had a couple of weeks ago, there were some very long ones. It's very difficult in the dynamic of a situation like this to try and read it all. If you keep it short, there's a better chance that I'll pick it up, and I'll certainly read out your name if you post it. And so short, to the point, these are the best ways to ask your questions. And after each of the interventions, I will take in 2 or 3 of the questions that are posed by you, the attendees, and asking the experts about the points that you wanted to raise. I'll also save 1 or 2 of the questions for the very end. Once we've finished hearing from each of the individuals, we'll have a brief open discussion. And I would like to say that whilst we can't meet in person, we can still try to interact. So please do send your questions. Do use the question function in the right-hand bar. And well, I suppose without further ado, I would like to introduce Luis. And indeed, as I said, he is the energy attaché at the German permanent representative permanent representation to the European Union, based here in Brussels. And indeed will be leading many of the pieces of work that will be undertaken during the German presidency. And Luis, I'd like to start by making a quick sort of, I don't know, a contextual analysis. I think that when we spoke a few months ago, we were very much expecting a very strong focus on energy within the German presidency. You have the climate law, there'll be the 2030 targets. And since then, the COVID-19 pandemic has come along, and everyone, I think, is thinking, does this mean that all of the focus and the effort will be on the recovery plan, or will there still be some energy priorities within your presidency? So perhaps if you consider those as guiding remarks for your input, we'd like to hear very much about how you see the German presidency going and what you will be focusing on in energy. Luis, over to you.
Thank you, James. Thank you for having me here today, for inviting me. It's a very timely discussion. I'm looking very much forward to your input, Andreas, Massimo, but also from all the other people from the audition, from the audience. Sorry. So we are now in the final phase of the preparation of our presidency, and this means that we have had some new thoughts. I think this Corona tragedy made us rethink a lot of our priorities, and I want to give you some insights now about what changed and what didn't change for the energy part of our presidency. So although we are still in the middle of the crisis, to be honest, I think everybody knows, we get ready now to speed up work again. And regarding our overall priorities, as you said, I think the recovery is still will be one of the main topics. One thing that's very important, so we supported the Green Deal before Corona, and we still think that it should be the core element of the recovery plan. So I think this continues to be to hold. I would call the recovery plan really our first priority. Of course, there are some crisis management things. I think it's very important for us to coordinate among member states the supply of medical equipment, and to reopen our borders as quickly as possible, so the internal market get the internal market working as soon as possible again. But the recovery plan goes further, so we want to work on economic, financial, and social measures. And we want to improve competitiveness and resilience of the European industry. And all this, for all this, the Green Deal should be the basis. So this is maybe our overall topic. Of course, the MFF, very much interlinked now with the recovery plan, will be another big topic. And regarding the targets that you mentioned, I think that we still it's still a priority. So we want to work to get the decision of the European Council to get climate neutral by 2050 into law as soon as possible, and we will see how far we can get regarding 2030 targets. I think my climate colleagues are very much engaged in this. It's not the energy team working on this; it's the climate colleagues. And I think we will see how far we can get. As a presidency, you know, we are just the presidency. There are 27 member states, and it will not be an easy task now to get things working again. As you said, we have the same problems as everybody else. Maybe being such a big institution with 27 member states, it's maybe even a little bit harder. to get things running again. So we will also meet mostly through video conferences, and yeah, being civil servants, we are maybe a little bit slower than the rest of you in adopting to changes. Regarding the energy topics, so our creation colleagues are right now working on council conclusions regarding the recovery and also preparedness. I think it's a very good idea to pick this topic up now. They still have time to do this. It's really a pity for our colleagues that they they had so many plans for this presidency, and yeah, they had to reorganize everything in such a short time. So depending on how Corona evolves, we may pick up this topic again. So after the Croatian colleagues will have this council conclusions in June, then we will see how it evolves in the following month, and if there's a necessity to pick it up again. Maybe later this year, with a little bit more of distance, we can look back and see how we can improve maybe risk preparedness and security of supply questions. For the moment, it looks as if preparedness of the energy sector was really okay. So no major problems over Europe. So I think this is quite good. Regarding recovery, one important topic will be the renovation wave, of course. I think this is clear. We will also deal with this, but I would say that our main priorities didn't change. They are still offshore wind and hydrogen, and both priorities can contribute or can have very important contributions to the recovery, because both fields need investments in the following years, and therefore it's a good choice to stay with these priorities. Regarding offshore wind, what we want to do is to foster regional cooperation, not only in the North Sea, where Germany is quite active, but European-wide, so over the whole European Union. There are great potentials in the Baltic Sea, and also in the Mediterranean. The Commission is now doing a study, but even in the Black Sea, we see some potential. So I think every member state can be involved, even the ones without a shore. That's the big advantage, because you can either financially contribute. You can get your renewable share from installations in other member states, but also offshore wind contributes to security of supply. So in the end, we think it's a win-win for everybody. And this is why we want to have an enabling framework, because we see that not many projects are taking off right now, and we think that more investment security is needed here. And this is why we make this a priority. So we are looking forward to the offshore energy strategy from the Commission, of course, and we'll see what we can do. So our goal is to have council conclusions in December in this field. Second topic is hydrogen, as I mentioned. As you already said, the decarbonisation of the gas sector is it's the next task we have to look into. We will have a high demand for gaseous energy carriers over the next decades, also in 2050. And if we want this to work, we need to decarbonize the gas sector. And hydrogen is not only a solution for the gas sector, but also for other sectors that are difficult to electrify. So we think that the main problem of the whole hydrogen topic that we have been discussing now for the last year or longer, but the discussion raised in the last year, is that there are so many people and parties involved. There's so many angles, and it's not right to look into it only from the energy sector. So we are very much looking forward to the strategy from the Commission that will give us a broader overview over the different parties involved. Because, well, you end up all with the same question: do we start with the demand side? Do we start with production? Do we start with rules for the market, or do we let the market evolve? So we will pick up the discussion from the hydrogen strategy from the Commission and see how far we can get. We really want to get clarity as soon as possible. So in 2021, when the Commission comes up with their legislation proposals, maybe we can always already have the first ideas regarding hydrogen there. And then, well, of course, not our priorities, but still important, and we will still deal with them, is the energy system integration strategy. The first communication from the Commission regarding the main energy policy, or giving the energy policy outline for the next years. We are very much looking forward to it and want to pick this up too. Of course, the NSCP and the 2030 goals. Is there an emission gap? How do we close it? This discussion will raise too. And yeah, last but not least, the strategy to reduce methane emissions. We want also to see what we can do with this. Right now, I think, as everybody else, we are waiting for the new work program, for the adopted work program, and we will see if what new conclusions we can draw out of it, and when we can expect the different communications. And based on this, we will maybe readapt a little bit the program. I have the feeling that I talked already enough, so you can ask me whatever you want. Happy to hear from you and from the audience what the concerns you have.
Well, you've kept the time perfectly, actually, Luis. So there was no need for me to interfere with what you're saying. Anyway, I think everyone was very, very keen to listen to that, and you've given a kind of good tour de force of all of the major issues that you see, and your priorities in energy, as well as the broader context of the MFF and the recovery plan. I just remind the attendees, as I said, to also ask questions, to use the question function. We've had a couple that have come in. Well, one of them I'm not sure you'll be able to answer, but I think we'll ask in any case. Siobhan Hall, who's a journalist who works for Platts, is asking, when will Germany deliver its 2030 National Climate and Energy Plan? You have to smile, Luis, but I'm sure you can't give us a date, but maybe if you give us an idea of ongoing work.
Soon. Yeah, I can't give you a clear answer yet. I expected the question we get asked everywhere where we appear right now. But I'm sorry, we are really closing it, and I hope we can really send it in soon, so that the Commission can start the evaluation.
I mean, I would just relate it to one point. I mean, you've mentioned the European Commission's hydrogen strategy. In Germany, you have your own hydrogen strategy that's still under discussion. Is that somehow linked to the NECP, or are they totally separate? Or would you like to have your hydrogen strategy before you do your NECP?
Not so much in this case. So of course, there is an interlinkage, but no, the discussion is separate. And I think one topic I didn't mention before, so and I wanted to make clear is regarding the hydrogen strategy. So we want to publish our hydrogen strategy soon. Other member states have done so already, or will do so soon. And I think one major task during our presidency is to get everybody on board, because we are noticing that there may be different levels of engagement right now and of preparedness. So there are member states that would like to start tomorrow or even today with big hydrogen potential, and other member states that still are because of the history of the current situation, focusing much more on getting rid maybe of coal, or starting to use gas much more, and natural gas. And therefore, I think it's an important thing that if we want to have a European approach and not to end up with 27 different strategies on hydrogen, we need to work on getting everybody on board. And this just takes maybe some more time than it would be just to go without looking left or right with our own strategy.
Well, I guess that we are all, I fully understand that, Luis. And I guess that what we are all hoping is that the hydrogen strategy that's expected at the same time as the energy system integration strategy or communication from the European Commission will at least set some boundaries in where they see the use and how to actually, as you say, create the cooperation amongst the 27 so that you don't have 27 different approaches in 27 different states. In a way, I'll just take one more question from Alexandra Tudorio Lakovice, who I believe works for Cogen, and she's asking, do you see a role for hydrogen use in buildings? And do you expect hydrogen to be part of the renovation wave initiative from Germany's perspective?
Well, I think we try to be as technological neutral as possible. I think it's not a main focus, to be honest, but it's not an issue where we say no, we don't want hydrogen in buildings right now. I would say it's just that I'm not aware of many projects, to be honest, but it's my personal view. But from a general perspective, we are open to everything that helps to decarbonize.
And then just the final question I've got from Poppy Kalesi from the Environmental Defence Fund is picking up on your last point about methane emission strategy and just saying, will the German presidency consider methane emissions in the European gas supply chain, including from imports, I think is the point that she wants to look at. Do you have any formative opinions or views on that?
Well, I think that we will see what the Commission will really put on the table. We are in close exchange, and I think it's a very important issue, and we will see what we can do in the Council with it. So it's a topic that maybe not easy to get an opinion, a common opinion in the Council in weeks. So we need to discuss it maybe over a longer time. But let's see when we can really expect something from the Commission, and then we will of course deal with it. Yes.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for that, Luis. I think in the interest of time, we will move on. There are a large number of questions. I thank the participants for that. Some of them are quite generic, so I will probably keep one or two of those towards the end, and so there will be a chance for those to be answered by the panelists. I think now we go on to Andreas Graf. Andreas Graf, representing Agora Energiewende. Andreas, thanks very much for joining us this morning. If we go back to the 2030 targets discussion, the main purpose of this webinar today, I think the participants and ourselves would be very interested in hearing your views in Agora Energiewende about what the ambitions for 2030 targets should look like, how ambitious they should be. Do we need to go to 55 or do we go to 65%, as we see the S&D and the Greens in the European Parliament starting to call for? I know you have a number of studies that have looked at various aspects and various elements of the economy as well. And maybe as a second point, beyond your views and ambitions around 2030, I think we would be very interested to hear, how would you see the role of renewable and decarbonised gases in supporting any increased ambition? Andreas, the floor is yours. I'll do my best not to interrupt you for 10 minutes.
Thanks a lot, James, for that question. So let me start by first, prefacing, of course, my statement with the fact that obviously COVID-19 is having an impact on the discussion around the energy sector. I mean, seeing the spring forecasts of the European Commission on economic growth, things are changing, and that change of economic activity is raising uncertainty. And with that uncertainty, we are seeing, on the one hand, I think, in my view, knee-jerk reactions that are to some extent calling into question some of our intended plans on climate. On the other hand, we're seeing potentially an opportunity to speed up the agenda. And I think both of those things are happening at the same time. And looking at where we stand on 2030 climate ambition, I think first we have to take a step back and reflect on where we stand in terms of the European debate on climate ambition. And I think it starts by first taking a look at where we were in 2018, which was at the end of a long cycle of discussions around 2030 target ambition that had started even prior to the Council conclusions in October 2014, saying that we should aim for 40% emissions reductions by 2030. And throughout a large number of different negotiations, we agreed on a policy framework for that in terms of emissions reductions in the ETS sectors and the non-ETS sectors. And we also went forward and had a large set of negotiations on revising the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, and setting new energy targets. Now, so in that sense, we had finished and converged upon a common understanding in the EU on our climate ambition. I will say that it is not an unambitious target level in the sense that it will already mean a fundamental transition in our energy system, and I think that has to be underlined. That being said, I think we also saw in 2018 the beginnings of a reassessment and a reevaluation of where we needed to go. And I think most prominently, the starting point for that conversation was the 1.5 degrees special report of the Ipcc. And with that came a large public discussion and increased pressure from a variety of new and kind of established public voices that we needed to go further. And I don't think that's surprising, considering that we have maintained a 40% emissions reduction target from 2014, which was established prior to the Paris Agreement even taking effect. So we are in a place of kind of reopening that discussion. So when we reflect on where we are in COVID-19, this discourse around climate, I don't think we should start with a conversation about is there convergence or divergence per se. We have had convergence on the ambition. I think first of all, I think we are seeing convergence in the sense that no one is questioning the targets we have already set for ourselves, and no one is questioning fundamentally the need to revise climate ambition. At least I am not seeing enough of a challenge to that to warrant significant concern. So you heard it from Luis earlier today. Green recovery is a fundamental aspect of recovery. So where we are entering now is a discussion on where should we go, and where should we go beyond the 40%. And the Commission had proposed a target range of 50 to 55%. And even there, I am hearing more voices discussing whether it should be 50% or 55%, as opposed to whether that target range should be fundamentally questioned. So I think if, again, to underline the commonalities here or the kind of continuity, we are seeing convergence around the need for higher ambition, and I think it was inevitable that then in a discussion around that target range, we would see different opinions, different shots across the bow in terms of concerns about which direction the policy architecture should go. So we're entering into a negotiation, and so we have heard some voices here or there from industry or from certain policymakers from specific member states indicating some of their concerns. And yet, I think fundamentally we have convergence around what target range we should be discussing. We at Agora fundamentally believe that if you then look at the science, we have no other option but to aim for the highest possible target in this range, and that for us is 55%. We are assessing at this moment exactly how we think that policy architecture could look like and what policies really need to be added to the mix for us to accomplish that, and we will be coming out with further thoughts in the coming months. But I think to underline very clearly, we believe that if you look at the science and you look at the where we need to go also in the long term with 2050, another area of convergence where we have agreed to the common vision of climate neutrality, we will need to take that ambitious step in the medium term. Now, where we are seeing, and I think you've hinted at this with your 65% comment, a certain divergence is that we have others in the discussion who also highlight that even 55% is probably not enough for what needs to be done, especially if you take into account the 1.5 degrees target. So I don't think there's any way around saying that 55% is not compatible with a 1.5 degrees target. I think full stop, that what we have here is an effort to go as far as is currently deemed possible in the political space, in the technological space, and what we believe is possible given the challenge of mobilizing an entire economy towards this common purpose. And it is not unambitious. We are seeing truly an enormous transition here placed upon us if we are going to go ahead with this with ambition at the scale. So that's where I see us in the target discussion. We have new voices with Jutta Gutteland, the rapporteur of the climate law, putting kind of for the first time as a policymaker, kind of publicly backing a 65% target. And we are going to see increased, I think, I wouldn't call divergence, but less of a confluence of ideas in all aspects of this discussion about how far we should go. Now, what does that mean for gases? And I think that's what you want to hear. I think if we want to look at this target discussion and consider what it means for gases, we actually have to go beyond 2030. Because what's important for determining what has to be done in the medium term is to first reflect on where you want to go in the long term. And the EU has, again, I think heads of state and government have agreed that there's going to be a common vision of achieving climate neutrality by 2050. And what that means is certainly that we will need to decarbonize gaseous energy carriers by 2050. And that we will need to dramatically scale those technologies in the coming decades. Now, I think the traditional view in kind of a modeling focused understanding of how this would happen is we were taking a very, let's say, static and simplified view on how that could be done in the most cost efficient way. And often models would just spit out some of these technologies after 2030 with no consideration for what has to be done prior to that to make that ecosystem happen. So, if you look at some of the kind of studies that have been done over the past decade or two, we have not reflected strongly enough upon what needs to be done. And I think what the hydrogen strategy discussion that Luis referred to over the last year has kind of highlighted is that we need to go beyond this, and that it will take a real industrial strategy on the part of the EU to drive forward these technologies and to allow us to achieve our long-term targets. So what that means is that looking towards 2030, we need to be on a pathway towards achieving our longer term targets, and we need to dramatically scale these technologies by using a variety of different instruments. I'm just going to summarize them by saying I think they come at different levels. I would say downstream, midstream, upstream. So if you start with upstream, then we're talking about actually supporting the production of clean hydrogen and renewable gases. This could take the form of, for example, clean hydrogen auctions, but also support for manufacturers of different components, manufacturers of electrolyzers, for example. On the midstream front, we need to put the infrastructure in place to actually get these energy carriers to market, and we need to do that planning and that regulatory policy action today. We can't wait for the discussion to get to a point where we have enough kind of clarity to start considering how we're going to get to these energy carriers to market. We need to be thinking about these things in a cohesive way. And finally, we need to have downstream policies that actually coordinate that demand so that we can have the production being delivered through the new infrastructure we've created to I think, in my opinion, ideally the sectors that in the long run will most need these gaseous energy carriers. And for that, we will need policies such as carbon contracts for difference for industry, such as perhaps a quota for hydrogen, and perhaps blending quotas for aviation fuels to the extent that hydrogen and gaseous fuels are used in the aviation sector. So these are just some of the examples, but I think we need to look at clean hydrogen and renewable gases as an industrial strategy focus. We need to create an ecosystem. And so just finally, I would say at the EU level, what we certainly need is an enabling framework. And that will require us to look at the state aid framework that exists for investments in these areas. We will need to make sure that the investments can be made, that member states are not prevented from doing so by unnecessary concerns for investment in this area, where there is a necessary concern, and there are concerns about internal market competitiveness in this space. I think the Commission should play a gatekeeper role. But I think there is an important function now of the Commission to make sure that investments are taking place. There's in terms of offshore capacity that is needed. Luis referred to the regional cooperation that will be needed to make sure that we actually roll out offshore wind capacity at scale. I think some of the efforts of the German presidency are excellent in that direction. And I think I'll end with that, just saying, we will only get to our long-term goals and our long-term vision in this context if we start thinking about this space as an industrial policy challenge today.
I think that's a really good point to end on as well, Andreas. And I think, again, a very good, coherent set of ideas that you have expressed very, very neatly, and I think very easy for us to understand. I think that I would go directly to the questions, if you don't mind. We'll go. Mariana Paiva from Galp, it's a gas distribution company in Portugal, is saying, you mentioned things like quotas, sort of demand side policy, the tools. And she's saying, do you think there needs to be an EU target for renewable gas consumption by 2030? Do you see a specific role for that sort of step in Agora Wind? Not necessarily you personally, but in Agora Wind. What are the kind of ideas you have around stimulating the production, if you like? Is it going to be done through demand side, or do you also believe that you need to do the demand side plus the, as you mentioned, the sort of the stimulation of production of the technologies?
So I think, I would just prefer not to get bogged down by a question of is a target the right instrument, because I think it is one instrument, or it is one type of policy that can stimulate the investment that we would need today to create that industrial ecosystem. And if policymakers find that to be the way they would like to proceed, to have kind of a common vision and a common target in this space, then go for it. That being said, I think there are some concerns about overall where will gases be going, and that discussion is still unresolved. I mean, Luis mentioned his kind of personal view, at least on the role of these gases in the building sector. I think every member state will deal with those concerns perhaps differently. And at the same time, we might want to set certain common guardrails or kind of frameworks that determine where we think these gases are best going in the coming years. So is the target, and just to get to the target, I think to some extent it's a bit too open in my view in some ways, because I think this industrial ecosystem will most flourish if we set a vision for the industry that makes sure that those investments are robust to future developments, to future public sentiment, to future regulatory developments. And so getting that correct might mean that we need more tailored policies, including auctions, including demand instruments for specific sectors where we have really come to a common view on where they should go. But this is not precluding the possibility that member states might put on guardrails and then create a target to make that happen as well. So.
Yeah, I think that we know that there are some countries that are already pursuing targets, and we see that as a growing trend. In any case, one of the things that Luis did talk about was the general sort of hydrogen strategy, and then talking about sectors. We got a question from Geert de Kock from Transport and Environment, saying, are there some sectors where hydrogen should not be prioritized? And I originally meant to ask Luis that, but actually I'd ask you that, Andreas. In Agora Energiewende, do you have a view where there are specific sectors that you think should use hydrogen, and then equally ones which wouldn't use it?
So the way you asked your question was, are there any sectors that should not be prioritized? And in my view, it depends on what you mean by prioritized, because I don't think there is any sector that will not need in one form or another gaseous energy carriers in the future. Full stop. That being said, the scale of what we need in the different sectors might be very different. And the way we thought about them in the past might have been wrong, in my view. And so, just to take the building sector as an example, I think there will continue in the future to be buildings where gaseous heating plays a role, including historical buildings where it's difficult to renovate. And I think when we look at the overall energy system and what is the best way to achieve our goals cost efficiently, we might come to the conclusion, for example, that hybrid heat pumps play a role in making sure that peak demand on the electricity side is not does not reach a level that it's no longer manageable. So, I do think there is a role here in every single sector. And then when you ask, kind of should it be prioritized, I also see that there will be a challenge in scaling these technologies at the speed that we envisage. We are talking about massive transformations. So in that sense, it depends a bit on how quickly we can scale clean hydrogen and renewable gases, and to the extent that it is a limited energy source in future potentially, we should be channeling it to whatever extent possible to the industries I think that are difficult to decarbonize, and that would, to me, mean first and foremost heavy industry and long distance transport. But there are different views on this, and that discussion is unresolved.
No, thank you for that, Andreas. And I do have to cut you off in the interest of time, but I find that really insightful. As I said, a good coherent set of ideas put forward, as we expect from Agora Energiewende. And I think as well, food for thought for all of us, and all of us that also support the idea of targets. So greatly appreciate those comments. We now move on to our last panelist, and by no means least. I'm very happy to have Massimo Miccinilli from CER, the Centre for European Regulation. As I said, it's a think tank based here in Brussels. And last year, you were able to produce a study, Massimo, that was looking indeed at the potentialities for delivering renewable and decarbonised gases. And I think that one of the things that you came out with in your assessment was that it may be useful to set things like renewable targets to drive an increase in 2030 targets ambition overall. So in fact, it's a kind of link between the two. If you drive more ambition, you should also drive more ambition in the decarbonisation of gas. I wonder if you maybe just take us through some of the key findings, and also maybe if you want to put your study into the overall context of the COVID crisis and the Green Deal, and also the socioeconomic elements that you perceive through your works and through your studies. Massimo, over to you.
Well, thank you, James. Thanks a lot for the invitation and all Eurogas team behind this online debate. I'm very glad to be here with you. But let me start first with try to answering your main question, which is about the targets. If you want to reach climate neutrality by 2050 or before, you need two different types of instruments. First, you need policy direction for the entire EU, and such direction can be given by setting EU-wide mandatory targets. In my experience, it's been critical for the 2020 package process, and now even more important to structure our energy union governance. However, targets are not the silver bullets to deliver climate results, and I agree with Andreas, but rather a necessary enabler to structure policy in the entire EU bloc. So failing to set them, it would mean an implicit invitation for member states to deliver standalone policies. So an open question for all is, do we really want that? Would it be good to have involuntarily flexibility from member states? Now, the second type of instrument which should enact those targets is the EU regulatory toolbox that should aim to help the sectors involved to apply to the best cost-efficient solutions today and tomorrow. And I'm saying tomorrow because we're talking about massive investments that should be needed. Now, on the second point, and now back to the CER study that we published last year. This study is trying to assess the case for renewable gases and hydrogen from an economic perspective, right? So the conclusion is pretty clear. Despite the massive production potential in Europe, it is unlikely that renewable gases and hydrogen will easily work their way through the market unless adequate support is put in place. So, for instance, the study proposes EU targets for biomethane by 2030 and 2050. But not only, it suggests considering an introduction of cost-effective and tender-based production support schemes for renewables and hydrogen, increasing their access to the grid via discount on fee for fixed networks, providing priority access in case of congestion, reinforcing the transparency, interoperability of guarantees of origins, and of course, evaluating all these measures over time. Now, these options were not taken out of the sky, but they were a result of an exhaustive assessment of regulatory national frameworks implemented in 6 different member states. Sorry. You have Germany, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Belgium, and UK in the study. So this means that national policies are making progress in this field. And even if you don't have 100% convergence today, I think that the Commission and also the German presidency should look into the best practices for future regulation. I'm conscious of time, and let me just share 2 last points. One about the targets. Yes?
You're doing fine. You're doing fine. Still got 5 minutes.
Okay, so let me share 2 points. One about the targets themselves and one beyond the targets. Setting the new 2030 climate targets will be a systemic game changer. So I agree with Andreas. This is a fundamental change in the energy system. Now, we are much closer to disruption than incremental change. And I do believe that there will be, and there is a political consensus to move today from -40 to -55% in 2030. Now, if you wish, since the Kyoto Protocol process, end of the 90s, where member states decided for the first time to jointly reduce greenhouse gas reductions until today, we were in the kind of this driving a car in a national road with a speed limit of 90 kilometers per hour. And now with these new targets, I think we are embarking into a highway of decarbonization with almost no speed limit. So it's clear that all sectors need to make an effort to manage this new speed of decarbonization, but at the same time, delivering security of supply and, very importantly these days in the COVID-19 crisis, reinforcing what I would call pan-European system resilience. So your sector, the gas sector, has the opportunity to start the reflection from a functioning and integrated market that has to lead to decarbonization scenarios with your technologies and adapt to an increasingly disruptive energy system. The second message, and I think there I'm going to move a bit beyond the targets, is to look a bit more, I would say this again and again, about what is beyond the target. So actually, the complexity of the targets is reflected in the Commission's public consultation in 2030. I don't know if you have seen that, but please have a look at the technical part 2 to be more precise. There are multiple policies interacting: ETS reform, effort sharing decision reform, LULUCF. Here we're talking about the real distribution of efforts between all the sectors of the economy to decarbonize. This is a massive exercise, a regulatory exercise. So I'd like to give you an example for your industry. Let's assume that we will increase the ambition of climate targets for at least -60%, as MEP Goodland requested in the Parliament. My immediate question is, what does it mean for the future of CCS in Europe? The technology, pretty mature, is there, but still we don't know when and how. It's a bit tricky, huh? Well, probably it will depend more on enabling policies that the -60% itself. So, you know, and I'm talking about one of the core enabling policies, which is ETS reform and the CO2 price. With COVID-19, a relatively low and volatile price won't help this mature technology to take off, or at least incentivize the industry to have a pan-European plan to roll out the technology. So I think you, as an industry, you will need a roadmap 2050. And sorry, James, if you already have one, but now to understand how the new 2030 targets will shape your landscape, your technologies, and what sort of packages of policies are needed for you to hit the decarbonization goals. So just to conclude, all in all, I think that it's very important that we understand that the way we calibrate the overall policy and regulatory architecture of energy and climate, probably driven by the new climate targets, is critical and maybe as important as the targets themselves. Now, if I can continue maybe on the COVID-19, and I also support what Andreas is saying, it's very important to make a step back. I'd like to say a couple of things. First, this crisis has not a clear temporal endpoint. We don't know when the sanitary crisis will end and which effects will have in the long run for the energy system. Are we going to come back to pre-crisis level in 2021? Are we going to move into a new normal that will differ from what we expected? I don't know. Now, what we know is that there might be an economic recession, and this will hit member states and citizens in a very different way. You have seen, the W-shaped recovery or U recovery type. We will pick the letters you want, but I do expect that energy poverty will come stronger in some countries. Before the crisis, we have seen 50 million families in the EU that were facing energy poverty. So with higher unemployment rates and a 10% increase in energy needs per household that they are locked down, the situation will worsen. So I do expect increasing distributional effects of energy and climate policies to achieve ambitious targets. The consumer landscape and the abilities to respond to the crisis will be linked to recovery plans. But I suspect that there will be some fragile segments of the society that won't be able to pay bills anytime soon. So, and that's something not to be neglected from a social, economic, and environmental perspective. With that, maybe a very last point is about sector integration, because this was mentioned, and as a think tank, we're conducting a very ambitious research today. Now, a question for all of you. Should we set EU-wide targets for renewable gases and hydrogen before defining what sector integration will mean for the system? In what I can see, and I cannot disclose all the results of the study that should be published in October or December, is that the policy design, the configuration of the support measures, and the convergence of EU policies towards a very different model to interlink the energy system will impact gas, electricity, mobility, and heating pretty radically. So this does not prevent policymakers from setting EU-wide targets for specific technologies or carriers, but rather making sure that these targets will not contradict a smooth transition period for a potential sector integration. And I stop there.
No, that's great, Max. Thanks again for also kind of synthesizing also what we've heard from Luis and Andreas. I've got two very quick questions for you, and then we'll go into the final round for you all. I'm glad to say we've still got 195 people on the webinar, so although we're getting to the end, it's still very highly well attended. There are two questions that are coming to mind. One is coming from Gotcha Mehta, who I think believes works for the Energy Community Treaty. And she's saying, we talked about the tools, the regulatory things that we need to go through this energy transition. And she said it's taken 30 years to create an internal market for natural gas and the incumbent benefits for consumers. When we actually start blending hydrogen into that, what kind of challenges, how do we actually go about creating the hydrogen market? And do you think we can go faster, or do you not think that this is a barrier in any way, shape or form to delivering still competitive gas for industry and consumers? Sorry, I tweaked the question a little bit, Gotcha, but I think we have the main...
Yeah, if you can just repeat the question, because I'm...
Should I start then?
No, it's for Maximo, Andreas.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
Sorry, but I didn't get the question, to be honest. So if you can just repeat it.
Yeah. It took 30 years to create the internal market for natural gas and the benefits that we have for consumers, as you mentioned, energy poverty. How long will it take to create a similar market for hydrogen, or do you believe there's no issue because we just expand the coverage of the gas legislation to cover hydrogen?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So first of all, I think that it took a long time for the gas market with all the liberalization process and bundling. It was not easy, and I believe today the system, the integrity of the market is an asset, but it has to be transformed. And I believe that the transformation, there are two options. You try to replace it with hydrogen, which I would say full replacement would be very painful, very difficult, very lengthy. Another possibility is try to integrate them. Now, integration will require a lot of coordination, and that's we have a representative of Germany, the future presidency. Sorry, Luis Manuel. I believe, for instance, we're talking about blending, and when I go to presentations on different countries, and the blending, percentages here and there are different. So, question is, can we have a kind of a coordination, or we have like a kind of a corridor where we make sure that there is a kind of a common pathway to avoid that this asset that still the market infrastructure won't go away, and we will move into a multi-speed gas development that will end by destroying the market. And also, believe me, I mean, hydrogen is a key element to consider sector integration. I think that if you take out hydrogen, the idea and the temptation to go for sector integration, it changes dramatically. So I believe that it's better to go into adaptation of the markets and try to integrate them. And the last point, I believe, and I fully agree with Andreas, there has to be an industrial proposal for hydrogen, because the industries, and I used to work for energy intensive industries, they need to understand if they can switch and they can have access to low carbon energies. And I think hydrogen could be a solution, but the scale is the big challenge. So there where I think the Commission can help with some frameworks.
Then I have one final question for you, Maximo, and that is just, it actually relates very much to what you were saying, and I was planning to ask you this one anyway. Carsten Fraser is asking, what is the future of the existing European gas infrastructure? Now, you've mentioned the issues of blending. So how in your studies have you assessed the future of the gas infrastructure?
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. I don't want to hide. So the study, to be honest, it was not the scope of the study. The study just looked into the economic structures, the cost, and see externalities. And based on that, we come up with proposals. Now, the question, if I may personally, I would say that I think it will require a lot of planning, and it will require a lot of understanding on, as Andreas said, how we're going to move forward from where we are now and how we want to hit targets. And I think that has to be planned step by step. I believe that infrastructure, as you see it today in Europe, is very well integrated. But let's say that at national level, there are different views on what to do with that. So I believe that the sector integration piece should give the boundaries, as you said, and explain how we do that, because let's be honest, let's face it, at some point someone will say, okay, are we talking about repurposing infrastructure, or are we talking about decommissioning? So that debate could come. And I think we have to be prepared to say, okay, this is the plan, and step by step we see and we check to what extent we reform, we readapt, or we change.
Yeah, that's really very, very helpful. Thank you for the insights. And I thank all the panelists for that. I will now, we've had so many questions. It's not possible to answer them all. I'm sorry to all the people whose questions we haven't answered. But a number have focused on one question, and it's a recurring question, largely from the gas sector, I will say, from the participants. And they would like to know, I think from all of you, what do you think about the view of the hydrogen? Should we be pushing both hydrogen produced from renewable electricity and hydrogen produced from natural gas? And I think I will leave that as your final question, gentlemen. If there's anything else you would like to add in your final statement, please do. This is your moment to give a final summary of any points you would like to mention this morning. Luis, we'll start with you. How is the German presidency looking at the hydrogen? You know, the colours of the rainbow, I think I've seen Andreas Graf call it before on Twitter. How are you seeing it? Let's focus more on the blue and the green, so the one coming from renewable electricity and the one from natural gas. You see a role for both?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for asking me the most controversial question now at the end.
Everyone has to do
it. I think it's clear that where we want to go is green hydrogen and carbon-free 2050. It's also clear that it's difficult to imagine that we can provide enough renewable energy anyhow soon to get to a significant hydrogen market only with green hydrogen. And therefore, I think the way towards 2050 has to go through blue hydrogen. I think it's difficult to imagine that there's another way. But I want to pick up the discussion and the question that came up before, because I think the transition of from natural gas to hydrogen it's the main question, and the idea of different blending standards, or not even standards, because we have a lot of member states where no blending is possible, member states where it's maybe up to the industry, and others with quite clear standards. I think one question is, do we need, and to which degree do we need European standards? But I think the more important question is, do we have a plan to get from blending to carbon neutral gas carriers? Because if we start blending now and then in 2040 we say okay, now it's over with blending, we need a pure decarbonized gases. I don't see the plan for this transition happening, or I don't see it clear. So I think what we need is not only, I think it's very important to have now clear standards for blending, so that we can have really an internal market for this for gases. But it's even more important to have a view for what do we want to happen until 2050 with this blended gases, and this is I think one of the main questions. And then blue or green, as I said, it's for me, I don't as incoming presidency, I need to say that blue and green are not the only colors, and the discussion in the council is quite colorful. So I don't want to go into it because it's difficult enough to talk about blue and green, but there's pink, yellow, gray, or turquoise or whatever. So yeah, it's a difficult discussion.
I quite like the euphemism for colourful discussions in the council. I can only imagine, Luis. Thank you very much for your contributions this morning, Luis. Andreas, over to you.
Yeah, so indeed, I think a difficult conversation, but one in which I think I would also side on in kind of supporting the need for different hydrogen carriers of different. I don't like the color system, as you know, but indeed, given the amount or the scale of transition we want to undergo towards climate neutrality, I think creating that ecosystem will require us to get going as quickly as possible. And that's what tells the strongest story for what is sometimes referred to as blue hydrogen, fossil gas with CCS. We have existing hydrogen production today with steam methane reforming. For example, it would seem a no regret option to start applying CCS to this production and to actually capture CO2 today and store it. And yet even that is not taking place today. And so I think it's hard to argue against that. That being said, there are also concerns by some actors about what happens if we are trying to achieve carbon neutrality. Would those investments somehow be stranded assets in the long run? And I would say, again, given the scale of the transition we want to go to, I think throwing everything that makes some sense or engaging on everything that makes some sense should be pursued. That being, and we need to make sure that also we have some guardrails to make sure that we are investing in the right things. So for blue hydrogen, that means getting the methane linkage strategy right, and making sure that we actually have industry dealing with some of these cost-effective methane leakage prevention measures that they should have been doing, but they're not doing today to a large extent. So, you know, we need to make sure that everything is in place, and in that case, blue hydrogen can play a role, turquoise hydrogen can play a role, and many other, you know, color spectrum hydrogen carriers.
We're going to work on that color spectrum, Andreas, I can tell you. I think before we give Maximo the last word, you've given me an opportunity to plug our next webinar, which will take place, I believe, on the 26th of May, where we will indeed talk about methane. We will look at the methane strategy and also what the industry is doing to address the issue. So I think that's very poignant and the right moment to mention that. Very happy to say we have Environment Defence Fund and a representative TUGA, distribution system operator for electricity and gas from Germany, already confirmed. And as we have policymakers coming, that will come up. So thank you, Andreas, as well. Thanks for your great contribution today. Really value the input that you've made. Maximo, the final word this morning is yours. Okay,
what a pleasure. Thanks. Well, I would tend to agree with what has been said. I think if you don't think about the colorful discussion, and I had to work a lot on our piece to delete all the colorful and the color code of hydrogen, but I think, you know, between blue and green, I think, you know, time-wise, you need some, let's say, blue hydrogen to match the picture, because in terms of cost, you won't get to the green. So you know, in anytime soon. So you have to have something there in the transition. To me, question, as Andreas said, is what will happen with CCS. So do we need a specific framework to make it happen? Do we need something that will push CCS and make it a reality in Europe? Probably, and that's to be discussed. But then a bit more a political message. The front runners on hydrogen today, you know, I've seen some drafts of the German industrial strategy, and I think it's a very interesting and very overarching strategy. The front runners should try to set the framework for Europe I would say in the next 6 months. There has to be clear, together with the sector integration, to understand where are we going and how the industry can accelerate this, because otherwise we're talking about all these technologies, but this will start too late and we won't hit the targets. So we want to be serious with targets. Let's put together the implementation tools, the regulatory toolbox, and let's move, and let's maybe follow the leaders, but let's not try to create two different camps where you have the leaders and the laggards, and then you have issues with the gas market.
No, thanks very much, Maximo. Again, as ever, always very, very interesting comments, also shedding light on many of the issues that I think we will have to address in the coming years. What I will synthesize from what all of you have said this morning is that it's very clear that we need to get on and start doing it. Increased targets, whatever the percentage is, seem generally agree that that is a, as you say, Andreas, convergence around that. But in principle, we need to get the regulatory framework right, and we need to start doing the things that we are talking about today. And so, yes, there will be some pressure on your presidency, even in the COVID-19 period, Luis Manuel, just to make sure that we are indeed able to start creating the right building blocks to get that bridge to 2050 and get the policies right that will deliver the carbon neutrality. So yeah, I think I'm going to have to start saying that we all have to roll up our sleeves and get to work. I will stop there, and I will say thank you, Andreas. Yeah, I think we can all start doing that. No, I will stop there. I will say thank you to all the attendees who have come today, and really we've had a very, very large number, and a lot of you have stayed on right to the very end, and I really appreciate that. I apologize, we've overrun slightly, but I felt that the discussion was good, and we got some very, very useful insights, and I think many points for us to think a little bit more about as we go forward, trying to develop the policies that we'll need to deliver climate neutrality in 2050. And I also like to thank the panelists, Dr. Schultz, Maximo, Andreas. Really great to have you with us this morning. Thank you for spending your morning with us, and we'll look forward to continuing the discussions, probably like this for a while longer, and hopefully not too distant future in some form of a face-to-face meeting. I'd also like to thank the Eurogas team, as has been rightly pointed out by the panelists who've worked very hard behind the scenes to deliver this webinar this morning. I hope you've all enjoyed it. As I mentioned, on the 26th of May, we will hold our next one. We'll be looking at methane emissions and the strategy that's coming out of the European Commission. And we really hope you'll be able to join us then. Thank you all very much. Have a really great day. Stay safe, stay well, and let's meet in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.